everybody. My name is Patricia Lewis. I'm the Research Director here for International Security, and it's my great pleasure to welcome everyone to this really interesting discussion on online counterterrorism, the role of the public and private sectors. We have three fascinating speakers here with a lot of experience, and we're doing this in conjunction with Women in International Security, WISE, it's pronounced, and that's the UK branch of what is a global network of women in international security, and which is committed to promoting women's careers and providing a network for women working on international security issues. And if anyone in the room has had anything to do with them, they're an absolutely fantastic organisation, started in Washington, DC, but now have branches all over the world and provide some of the best expertise around. So we're really pleased to be able to do this meeting with WISE. So thank you very much, all you WISE people out there. I'm sure there are quite a few of you. So welcome to Chatham House again. We're going to be talking about the role of the public and the private sectors and what is a really important issue for today. And we're looking at how terrorist groups have exploited the internet and social media to spread propaganda and what to do about it. I'm going to start off by introducing our three speakers. Dr. Stephanie Hare is an independent broadcaster and researcher. She has been selected as part of the landmark BBC Expert Women Initiative. She goes on TV and radio all the time, and she has a regular radio column on the BBC World Service Business Report and the BBC Radio 4's Business Daily, and contributes regularly to the Financial Times, CNN, The Guardian, and Project Syndicate. She's worked as a principal director at Accenture Research, a deployment strategist at Palantir, and a senior analyst for Western Europe at Oxford Analytica. And she's taught history at Oxford, where she held the Alistair Horn Visiting Fellowship at St. Anthony's, graduate of LSE and University of Illinois. So welcome very much indeed, Stephanie. Thank you. Dunia Maluli is a senior research associate at ICSR, working in partnership with Voxpol Network of Excellence. Her research focuses on jihadi groups' online communication strategy and explores the relationship between the different communication channels used for propaganda and the type of ideological message they convey. Before this, Dunia conducted ethnographic field work in affiliation with the American University in Cairo and contributed to an economic and social research, cross-country research project co-funded by Google and hosted by the Adam Smith Research Foundation. She's also a part-time research associate for the Open University, which we're big fans of here, and has worked as a regional expert for a study commissioned by the British Council and the Goethe Institute in Egypt. She has a PhD from the University of Glasgow and an MA in Communications and Media Studies and BA in Arabic and Russian Comparative Literature from the University of Geneva. And then our third speaker is Dr. Erin Marie Saltman, who is the lead policy manager for Europe, the Middle East and Africa on counterterrorism and countering violent extremism at Facebook. Before this, Erin worked as a senior counter-extremism researcher at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, where she managed the Women in Extremism Programme, the Youth Civil Activism Network, and the Online Civil Courage Network. Her expertise includes tracking and countering far-right and Islamist extremism, and she's written on strategies on how best to counter mainstreaming extremism online to prevent young people from joining violent hate groups, and how to prepare against lone wolf attacks, amongst a whole range of other things. She writes, she comments, she's on the BBC, The Telegraph, The Independent, and the Jerusalem Post. She holds a PhD in political science at University College London, an international master's in economy, state and society from UCL, and a BA in international relations from Columbia, with a concentration in Francophone studies. So we've got a big Francophone component, a big Middle East component, a big private sector and public sector component, and as you can hear, an amazing amount of expertise. So with that, Stephanie, I'm going to turn to you, and you're going to open us up with some comments, and then I'm going to the other speakers after that, so welcome.
Thank you. Can I just check that everyone can hear the sound in the back? Yeah? Great. I can't see you.
I know.
It's just my eyes.
It's the real live stream.
So I am Generation X. I'm going to be working off of paper, which is also technology and pen, and my laptop. So bear with me as I'm working with my bifocals and constructed mind. What we're talking about here today is the use of technology, the internet writ large, but also social media platforms and different vectors of technology to facilitate terrorism, and then ways to stop it, and whose responsibility that is. So, we've gone for a really easy topic. Some of the biggest philosophical debates of whose responsibility is to police content online, what constitutes censorship of material that could be considered to be terrorist material versus something that's simply political dissent, how that's agreed upon, not just by different countries around the world, but also different companies, which might take a very different view. This is asking companies to have perhaps their own corporate foreign policy. We're also looking at some really great questions at the bottom here, which I really loved. So the old debate of security versus civil liberties, so security versus privacy, but also civil liberties writ large in terms of freedom of speech. The question of what responsibility companies, and particularly social media companies, need to take in terms of shutting down material that could be seen to be helping terrorism, or indeed is just actively criminal in nature. And one of the points that I would like to make in that is, how much of this is actually new in terms of these questions of responsibility. We have this from the private sector all the time with regards to products and services, and what is new about terrorism online as a product/service in terms of law. And then the last question, which I also love, what are the legal, commercial, and cybersecurity concerns that might be raised by states through the legitimate protection of their citizens? Questions about the word legitimate. Cybersecurity concerns are going to be really different potentially from legal and commercial, depending on what point of view you're taking and who you're representing, what interests you're representing. So I would like to use my time to give a couple of remarks on just 2 points today. The first is that the Information Commissioner's Office here in the United Kingdom has announced today, to my great delight, that they are going to be investigating the use of facial recognition technology in this country, which is largely unregulated, and it's what I've been doing my research on for the past 6 months. So why this is important is that facial recognition technology is, of course, very useful in fighting crime, right? And no one would dispute that. And our security services and law enforcement have been really affected by austerity in this country for the past 10 years, the police in particular. So you can see why they would leap at a technological hack that might help them. We've got a knife epidemic in this country in terms of just regular crime, particularly in this city. We've also, as a Londoner, experienced unacceptable levels of terrorism, and the police are under a great responsibility to fight that. So if they're given a technology, even though it's not particularly well regulated or even discussed or understood, they're going to go for it, and they're backed by the Home Office in trialing it. Unfortunately for them, they're also being pursued in the courts by Big Brother Watch, and in South Wales Police, which is also using facial recognition technology, they're being pursued by Liberty, both of which argue that facial recognition technology is violating the civil rights, the individual rights and freedoms of everyone else. So it's that classic conundrum just packaged up as something new of, is it worth compromising the civil liberties of everyone in this room if we can catch a hooligan, catch a criminal, catch a terrorist? And there's already, this is why I want to sort of push back a little bit on this question, there's a huge amount of scholarship on this already saying this is not necessarily a new debate. It's just new technology. The reason facial recognition technology, though, is new is that you are able to be surveyed without even realizing it. You don't know who's necessarily doing it because it's not always clear. It's totally unregulated in the private sector. So when we go on to biometrics in this country, we know that DNA and fingerprints are regulated, but facial recognition, your voice data, your gait analysis if you're walking, your online behavioral patterns, right? All of that stuff, this is second generation tech, that is not regulated at all. So it's exciting to have the ICO look at this, not because I'm an advocate necessarily for one argument or the other, but just that we need as a democracy to have an informed debate and discussion, and this will be watched, of course, around the world. The ICO is taking a really leading role as a regulator around the world on data protection, and it's really exciting to see it. My second point that I would like to raise in terms of what's new under the sun is that the head of MI6 today, Alex Younger, gave a very interesting talk about fourth generation espionage, talking about fusing human skill with technical innovation. And as a great fan of James Bond, I again push back saying, but that's always been the way. There's always been a combination of human intelligence and tech. But he is again right to point out that we're talking about technologies that are, some of them so experimental. So for anybody who's a cybersecurity geek, the idea that quantum computing could become viable within 5, 10, 20 years, and if you go onto the National Cybersecurity website, there's some really great white papers there, excellent cure for insomnia, but for nerds it's catnip, talking about this. They don't know when they think it's going to be viable, but they think it will be. And the idea with quantum computing is that it will be able to break the cybersecurity that we use today to protect and encrypt most data. So I don't need to take your data now and break it. If I can just hoover up all of your data and wait until that technology becomes viable, I can go back ex post facto and break your encryption, which would be very interesting, right? It's a risk that sounds sci-fi, it sounds implausible, but might be possible. And when you're in that world, you have to think about the crazy, that might be possible scenario. He's obviously also mentioned artificial intelligence, he's mentioned robotics. One of the things we were talking about before we came on is that artificial intelligence is very exciting, but there are known problems with the technology, and one of the big problems is also who is designing it. It's literally monocultural. There's not enough diversity, and that's not a politically correct comment. That's just a comment about getting the best brains in the room, and that means being able to see different risks and different opportunities. We know that's not happening yet. There's a whole crew of people that we need to reach out and bring into these discussions. Really exciting to hear the head of MI6 talking about that. He is not doing that because he thinks it's politically correct. He is talking about doing that because failure to do that means that the United Kingdom and its partners in intelligence sharing would be vulnerable. So it's really exciting to see that we're finally starting to get beyond some of the discussions that we're having in society and see how does this actually affect things on the ground. So I will end there and say thank you.
I should say as well as quantum computing, which is coming on faster than I think people had expected, that we're also seeing a whole raft of other quantum capabilities. For example, quantum image enhancement, which is not using quantum computing per se, and also quantum communication, which uses a different principles of different part of the quantum mechanics. And quantum mechanics, yes, for want of a better word, and actually will provide almost foolproof encryption. So these technologies take us places, and they disrupt and they change things, but some of them can provide new types of security. So, if I could go on to you, Dunia, now, from your perspective, looking at the private sector in particular, how is this being approached, these issues?
Yes, so I'd like to reflect a bit on the experience of tech companies, more specifically becoming more involved in this debate through counter-narratives campaign. So also with the case of Facebook and other tech companies partnering with civil society organizations to develop and fund counter-narratives campaign. And this, in a way, says a lot about how the private sector brings its own perspective to this question. So as we have seen, there are also cases where, this allows other stakeholders, such as the civil society, to benefit from the resources that the private sector can offer to also encourage alternative discourse, counter the terrorist or extremist, other forms of extremist discourses, which is beneficial per se. But the thing is, there's also, as we have seen, it's also tempting for tech companies, more specifically, to approach this particular issue by applying marketing practices, which is not necessarily the best approach. So as we have seen, for instance, when it comes to assessing the success and the sustainability of those counter-narratives campaigns, there has been a lot of marketing practices that have been applied in trying to assess the impact of some of these campaigns, looking at the number of tweets, the number of likes, and so on, which, of course, like helps quantifying the volume of people that become engaged ultimately in these sort of alternative debates, more inclusive forms of discourse. But at the same time, it also it's not exactly what is the most appropriate when it comes to determine what's the qualitative and sustainability of these forms of approaches. But it's an attempt, so it's that's a first step. When it comes to inviting the private sector at the table. Now, the other issues that I see, like personally as a sociologist, is that it also hides some other issues. When we put counterterrorism into the big picture of how other forms of, so how extremist narratives emerge online more specifically, we see that there's also, the thing is that with tech companies allowing technology users and social media users to sort of map their own sociological environment and develop their own communities and interact within their own communities and create their comfort zone when it comes to actually becoming involved in the public debate, we see that this also creates an environment of segregation where a sort of a bubble effect or echo chambers where people are less inclined to interact with other citizens that might not share their views. And this in itself might be a parameter when we try to understand why populations or social media users in general might become more vulnerable to terrorist propaganda, for instance. So what I want to say is that if we look at this phenomenon from a more sociological perspective, we also see that through counter-narratives campaigns that are also approached from the perspective of the tech industry, it does not help us when it comes to understanding the big picture and how the social media environment, so to speak, can also somehow set a condition of favorable environment for identity politics and extremist narratives online. But alternatively, if we actually start looking at, if we shift the focus and we start looking at this particular issue, we might also start engaging in another discussion with tech companies, more specifically, to try and ask them to become more, to reshape sort of the environment as it is, for instance, on social media, and try to engage people to interact, to sort of become more engaged outside of their comfort zone and interact with people that would not necessarily share their ideas. And this is, for me, sort of what would constitute a very innovative preventive approach, because it really goes ahead of, what it brings us to think and to think ahead and try to anticipate really like what would constitute the favorable environment, for an audience to become, as I said, vulnerable to those narratives. So that's one aspect. The other thing that I wanted to say is that beyond tech companies, there are also a broad range of other industries in the private sector that, of course, would that could have a beneficial impact and become more involved in this debate. The problem is that they don't want to become involved because they see the question of counterterrorism as too politically sensitive. So what I think would be really successful is to try and tackle some of the issues that relate to counterterrorism, but through the lens of different sub-issues that would not necessarily be regarded as, as security sensitive as counterterrorism itself. So for instance, through the scope of digital literacy, for instance, because there could be some interesting aspect of online extremism in general and online terrorism that can be addressed through the question of digital literacy. So that's just an example. But I think, and personally, since I also work on the Middle East, I also think that because everything is very often approach to the scope of security, it becomes very tricky for other stakeholders that are not necessarily well represented in the political debate to engage on those questions, So this is just a thought.
That's very interesting. Thank you very much. Erin, you've looked at different types of extremism online, and you're now working with one of the big online companies, social media companies, perhaps one of the biggest in the world, and the amount of data that exists. What are you learning?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, it's always better to be at the table than not at the table when we talk about social media and terrorism, and just kind of cut away at where are we seeing the problems online, and what can we actually do about it? What should we do about it? What maybe shouldn't we do about it at the cost of human rights or other liberties? So where do we actually have to draw ourselves lines in the sand and say, when is this about privacy versus security versus voice or freedom of speech? And those three pillars are constantly at odds with one another, not just online, also offline, with what you're talking about of how are we keeping people safe, but also recognizing privacy, but also trying to understand free speech and make sure that that's optimized. And I think when we look at the online space, the other duality that we're kind of touching upon within both of your talks is what is counterterrorism versus counter-extremism? And people often jump back and forth between terrorism and extremism. Both are disputed highly. Terrorism, maybe we can draw a harsher line in the sand because we can try to have a definition more so. Extremism is a very gray term. And so oftentimes when we're defining terrorism, I was very pleased that, although it's not without criticism for anything we do, we actually came out openly with our definition of terrorism. So Facebook not only said we're countering terrorism, if we're going to say that, we should probably say, what are we defining as terrorism? So we did that so that we could get better criticism back from the academic sector and practitioner sector in different parts of the world. And so that definition really looks at, well, we're seeing organizations that are mobilizing to carry out premeditated violence against persons, property, or international organizations to cause harm and to cause political or ideological change. That's a starting point. It's really taken off of a lot of different academic inputs and insights. It cannot be religion or ideology specific, because white supremacy terrorism looks a little different than Islamist extremist terrorism, or when I talk to my colleague in Singapore about Buddhist terrorism, that's going to look a little different as well. So we're looking at the violent, premeditated violent aspect of it. It's really hard when we look at white supremacy terrorism. Oftentimes we have a terrorist attacker, but the group identity they belong to might be a hate-based organization, but not a terrorist organization. So Anders Breivik is a terrorist, but he wasn't a part of a terrorist organization as such. Or the individual that murdered the MP Joe Cox, who shouted out Britain first as he attacked. We would consider that a domestic terrorist attack, but Britain First is not a terrorist organization. So we're having to define this space and realize that it looks different in different parts of the world. Language is different. Over 85% of our users on Facebook are outside of the US and Canada. I cover Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I have to be based in a time zone. I'm based in London. I can't wait for California to wake up. And my colleague in Singapore cannot wait for me to wake up if there's a crisis, because as it turns out, the internet does not sleep. And so oftentimes neither do we, but we also have to triage on time zones and culture zones and language understanding. So it's a very human aspect behind the scenes. But at the same point, when we've defined terrorism, we can definitely utilize technologies to the best of our abilities. Some of the things that we've done are around recidivism. So a few years ago when Daesh, ISIS became so popular, and you'd see another account boasting and saying, this is my 15th account. And you're like, oh no, how is that possible? How can this be the 15th or 50th account? We've gotten really good with some of the artificial intelligence about matching and recognizing that this is the same bad actor. We learn a lot from other abuse types like spam technology and see where we can reappropriate that. We've also gotten really good at things like network analysis, or what we call fanning out. When you look at processes of radicalization offline, these are very rarely, if ever, individuals in total isolation of other individuals. These are social processes. And we see the same thing online. It's a social network. And so the machine learning can identify a small cluster if we take down an individual for global terrorist offenses. and can identify a small cluster around that to triage that cluster to a human review team. So a lot of our most advanced technology triages between what can machine learning surface versus when does it know to triage it to human experts. We have over 200 individuals where their majority or full-time job is just on counterterrorism related issues. And that includes people on the policy team like me, but also engineers, data science, people from human rights law backgrounds, again, to make sure we're not solving for terrorism at the cost of human rights or over censorship. That's always an issue. But we've also looked at things like photo and video matching. That's been hugely helpful around propaganda, which seems to come back time and time again as a major issue. So once we know about an image or video, we can create a digital fingerprint of it, which we call a hash. And any subsequent upload of that within a certain variation of matching is automatically found and surfaced by the machine learning. It's a little different than other abuse types, again, because things like child exploitation imagery is illegal no matter what. Things like terrorism, you get a lot of different types of people sharing terrorist content for a lot of different reasons sometimes. So it's not just that if you share a piece of terrorist propaganda, you are a bad guy, you are sympathizing. We see BBC share a terrorist image, maybe the cover of a Dabiq magazine. You see certain media outlets share uncut entire footage of terrorist content. And so we need, again, to have the machine learning know, okay, this has context that needs to be reviewed. I will triage this to the human review team. Again, so we're not over-censoring. Some of the best counter-speech or counter-narratives might reappropriate images or clips of videos from terrorist content. And what that means is just this year alone, for our first 3 quarters, we took down, I think, 14.3 million pieces of terrorist content. And that sounds very scary and like a lot, but numbers alone mean very little, actually. So what we have to know when we look at the first 3 quarters is that there was a curve. So I think in quarter 1, we took down about 1.9 million. And then all of a sudden, we took down something like 10.4 million or 9.4 million pieces of content. And that's not because we saw a huge amount of terrorists just arrive on Facebook fresh. We just developed technology that was better at going back in time. So if there's 1 billion photos uploaded on Facebook every day, it was actually really hard to solve for old legacy content. Old Anwar al-Awlaki videos, he just keeps coming back. You know, some of these main players that keep getting shared, content that shouldn't be there. So our time got a little worse, like maybe our time to take down got worse the second quarter, but it's because the technology got better at going back in time. So you need these qualitative stories behind the scenes to understand the takedowns. And with this, we also see that the better we get at sort of quelling or preventing terrorist misuse or reappearance, it doesn't mean that bad actors disappear. It means they proliferate and change tactics. So this is one of the largest issues now, is that we see a proliferation. I don't think anyone in this room has just one app on their phone. You probably have at least 5, and bad actors are the same as anyone else. So the other issue is, if they know we're using certain things or getting better at certain things, we might see a conversation start on our platform, but as soon as it gets dangerous, it'll jump to a smaller, lesser known, more encrypted platform. Or we might see that the content is launched on a smaller, less regulated platform and then is encouraged to be disseminated on the larger platforms to hit optimal peak. And so we had to create the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism, which we launched last year, to work with other tech platforms. So that was founded by Microsoft, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. But it's so that we can proactively reach out to other platforms physically in different parts of the world as well as online, and reach out to other sectors more strategically, including an academic network that's actually led by RUSI here in London. But a lot of research often is one platform in one country, which is great, but the problem is multi-country, multi-platform. So we have 8 different institutes, and we hope to expand that out to give us better cross-platform and different regional perspectives on how violent extremism and threat is proliferating and changing. And then as far as extremism and counter-extremism, we do look a lot to marketing tools, I agree. We are looking at how do you trend something, how do you trend the counterculture, and so we should be doing that. It's up for debate if you'd actually want a tech company proactively breaking your filter bubbles. I think that's an interesting, I mean, if I'm going to say, you're a little conservative, read this liberal paper, or you're a little bit too right-wing, read The Guardian, I don't know. I think that people probably would have more concern with tech companies making that decision than not. So that should, anything like that really does need to be oftentimes with partnerships, just like Facebook shouldn't decide what truth is. When we talk about false news, we shouldn't be the arbiters of truth for the public. But these bring up a lot of questions. And actually, when you look at some of the far-right and white supremacy groups online, they're sharing liberal media and ripping it to shreds. So just shoving a different perspective in front of people is not always the way to get them to engage or plant a seed of doubt. We do need to work on the ground with civil society. That's where we might have the tools or the tech knowledge or the analysis behind the scenes, but that counter voice should not be a tech company's voice. It should not be centralized from us. It has to be in partnership with other sectors.
Thank you. So they're gaming the system, quite a lot of these groups, really. They're sort of pushing things back at you. They're finding ways around what you're trying to do, but they may also be playing it to some degree, I suppose. Is that one of the things that you're finding?
Well, I think just with offline, it's not, the threat isn't new. You change tactics. Everyone's changing tactics. Some of it's cat and mouse. The tech gains are where we really find these large scene changes. And again, we might just push it off our platform, in which case we do have an onus to help other platforms. One of the members of we have the photo and video matching technology that we actually share with a few other companies. So 13 different companies are in that, and we have about 100,000 unique pieces of content in there. And we label it so that people know what it's about. And that's where you get really big gains. So for example, the platform Just Paste It, if anyone's heard of Just Paste It, great, makes a lot of data available on shorter URL links. And terrorists loved it as well. And it's founded by one very intelligent man based in Poland, and it's not optimized to make money, it's just him in Poland. And he was, how do you challenge all this terrorism content? And he was able to optimize the hash sharing database to surface 76,000 unique pieces of content by using 11,000 nodes, just very quickly working with our engineers. And so those are big gains you can get from the tech, but it has to have oversight, it has to have people thinking behind the scenes of what consequences might be.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go out to the audience now, I think, and get some questions from you as to what you think, and any questions that you may have for our speakers. So I see a hand at the back, please. And if you could please identify yourself, and if you could stand, if it's possible for you to stand, it would be really helpful, and people can hear you better.
James Spencer. The BBC is already doing curation, I believe they call it, whereby if you go onto their iPlayer and they don't like what you're watching, they will send you counter stuff. The big concern I have is who decides this, and for that matter, can anybody hack into this system and then tweak it subtly? We've seen all sorts of stuff that's been manipulated. Unless it's very well protected, it's a huge vulnerability.
Anybody want to tackle that one? I mean, this is fairly standard technology.
I mean, all tech platforms will have different types of optimization, and probably my marketing teams will know a lot more about how to optimize things around how to get you to buy or look at things or things like that. When it comes to hate speech or extremist content or gray areas, I think that becomes a little bit different. I know that, for example, YouTube, not to speak for them, but YouTube and Google worked with different NGOs to develop the redirect method. So whereby if you were searching for very explicit, either Islamist extremist content or far-right neo-Nazi or white supremacist content, it would redirect you to a playlist that contained counter-speech or counter-narratives. And it had some interesting results behind the scenes. It would measure, how much of that video did you watch? Did you jump on to more content within that playlist? A lot of it, again, we're talking about reach and engagement. So to your point of measurement and evaluation, people will still go back and say, but did it change you? Did it change your sentiment? Do we see behavioral change? That's often very hard to measure. It's also very hard to know what someone does offline. So measuring your behavior online, I mean, if somebody profiled what I searched during the day, dealing with everything from neo-Nazis to white supremacists, or maybe look at mermaids, something else, I probably look like a complete psychopath. Don't quote me on that. But it's true. So I don't know what somebody does offline or off of a platform. And the more nefarious somebody is, the more they're going to probably try to hide in different ways on different platforms. And that's when you see proliferation to smaller platforms. But I think on the curation side, there is something to be said for if somebody is explicitly looking for dangerous content, there are certain patterns you can see, then it's a very interesting way of redirecting it to civil society-made counter-speech or counter-narratives. There's a lot of work being done behind the scenes on that.
Have you done any gender analysis on these numbers? You know, what sort of patterns are we looking at in terms of behavior?
I always think it's funny when people are shocked that women join violent extremist networks. I can't think of a single one that women haven't joined to start with.
What sort of numbers, though?
Well, when we looked at Daesh and recruitment as foreign terrorist fighters, first and foremost, people didn't want to call them foreign terrorist fighters. Like, are they fighting? These are very dedicated women that were joining a few years ago. And same in the neo-Nazi movement, you see tons of women. They tend to be more operational. They tend to identify in different ways. It's hard to specify in numbers. And also, they tend to be more elusive.
But
so
percentage-wise, what would you say?
Percentile-wise, I think numbers that I know of, if I looked at recruitment it really depends on group. Again, different violent extremist group types. But I think that when people were looking at foreign terrorist fighters joining Daesh, it was at some points in different countries up to 30% were women joining. But that's, again, online is elusive. That was from offline foreign terrorist fighters data for people trying to track Westerners that were joining and fleeing and leaving countries.
Great. Please, here. Thank you. Wait for the microphone, because otherwise we can't hear you. Great, it's here, it's here. Great.
Nafisa Abdullaeva, postgraduate, Brunel University student. Like continuing the discussion regarding the genders, in Central Asia, I could say that women recruiters are more successful than men recruiters, and also online. That's according to the last researches. And the question is, are there any social, I don't know, maybe researches or strategies on understanding why women are better recruiters than men, and why they are going to join to this kind of activity? So what's the grounds of this? Another question is, you mentioned the terms and definitions on terrorism and extremism. We know that there is no unified definition even in the international organizations, even in the international community, like UN gives their own definition, OSCE gives another definition, and others. And we know that different countries, like say Russia, they could use this for, if I'm blogging and writing something in my blog, and it could be against just regime, and it could be like extremism. So are there any, what international community is going to do with harmonizing of the legislations of countries? Are there any tools to that? This is the second question. And
that's great, thank you. That's a very big question, I think. Perhaps I could go, Stephanie, to you and just see, you know, I mean, if you look at international definitions of terrorism, Facebook put themselves out there. The UN hasn't been able to agree a definition on terrorism. So how do we harmonize all of this that's going on internationally?
It's an interesting question, because I think it's even questions like regulating artificial intelligence. I can't speak to your first question about gender. I haven't researched that, so I wouldn't want to put my oar in on that. But on the second one of common definitions on the international sphere, what's really interesting, this is just very early stages research, but we were looking at something, I did like a sort of straw poll of 200 companies who were looking at who they think should be responsible for regulating AI. And these were internal auditors of companies who were answering this question. And they overwhelmingly said the boards of, they wanted it done at the supranational level, which I thought was hilarious, because on the ground, who we see coming up with codes of practice around AI are companies who are using it, universities and academic researchers, sort of independent researchers. National strategies for AI are wonderful in promise and in label, and in countries like the United States, they tend to have a quite defense orientation. There's nothing, you know, there's sort of no there. There's this sort of like, I think it's the UAE as a minister for AI, and it sounds great, but sort of when you look beyond it, there's not a lot of substance behind it. I think everyone is waiting for someone else to take the lead, but I guess my question back on something like that is, does it really matter? Like, do you need the United Nations or NATO to have a treaty about cybersecurity or what constitutes cyber war, because actors are not necessarily even going to be nation-state actors. I feel like sometimes the language and the expectations that we're using are like 20th century thinking. And I'm also from that century, so it's really natural to go back to that. I worry that the thing that's wonderful about technology, the promise of technology, of it being borderless and universal, is also going to be the thing that challenges us the most, because if we spend all of our time just trying to get people to define artificial intelligence, and you can't, nobody agrees on even that yet, or what cyber war constitutes, or whether or not you should be able to attack back or not. The criminals and terrorists and people who are doing these things will not be waiting for treaties to be posed, but if we also don't have that discussion, if the UN and other supranational institutions don't step up and do something, what are we left with? Are we left with Google having its principles on artificial intelligence that are not enforceable in law, not enforceable by regulators? You as a consumer or a citizen have absolutely no legal protection and reassurance because Google decides to suddenly break its own code of ethics, as we've seen with its actions with DeepMind. So I think you're onto something there. I feel like you've hit something, and I don't have an answer. I just agree with you that it's a question.
And there are a lot of attempts at the moment to try to regulate in cyberspace. And we have, all of the groups of governmental experts in the UN. We have the new high-level panel of the Secretary General. We have the new attempt to have a treaty led by Russia in the General Assembly. We have the Paris call just a few weeks ago, led by Microsoft. There's many attempts at the moment, have various commissions going on. Everybody's trying to grapple with how to manage this, because even though we can't agree on things like the terms and definitions, it is nonetheless an international resource that goes right across boundaries. It's really hard to try to create something that's just national. We have to create something that's also international. It's national actors trying to do it, and therefore it's very difficult. Erin, you wanted to come in on this?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point that I think we did feel pressured to come out with a definition of terrorism on our own terms that really looked at behavior and action, not at ideology or identity, which is very surface level, because when we say we counter terrorism, what does that mean first and foremost, like I said, but also so that when a government or another entity flags and says, this is terrorism, take it down, we also have that definition to push back and say, by our definition, that is not. And I know that seems scary, and we don't question that usually in Western democratic societies, but in other parts of the world, we do get asked to take down lots of content that we have to push back on and that we don't take down. And that's thankfully why we have a transparency report as well, to at least speak to some of the numbers when governments do request. We say anything that you request, that gets reported on to some extent so that there's some oversight there. And I think there's constant work to try to be more transparent. And I think it's really the only way we can get better feedback from other sectors. This cannot be which sector is going to solve it. Each of our sectors by ourselves are going to be incompetent to get an actual impact done. So it's some legislation and regulation really helps us know the guidelines from other perspectives. Not all legislation is bad just because it's legislation that's going to affect our companies. Sometimes it really helps give us the guidelines. I would love to have more unified definitions on terrorism. The UN was one of the people that came to us. We work a lot with the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, and we had lots of discussions with them about our definition as well as other academics. And that's the only way we can excel and grow, not just as seeing each other as separate sectors, but as saying, how are we countering terrorism? What does that mean? How do we know we're being successful? It cannot be just each on our own.
Antonio, how much of this would help break down those bubbles, open up the channels of communication and essentially, create intrusion into people's little world views that they're operating internationally?
What I can say, at least when it comes to sort of debating the question of what should be considered as terrorist content, is at least from the academic perspective, of course, we are also struggling in the same way. I mean, as much as research is supposed to impact policy, it's also really hard from a conceptual perspective to agree on what is to be considered as terrorist content. So I think also because we've seen, for instance, I can give the specific example of in my consortium in Voxbone, when we were actually looking at the impact of censorship on potential clusters of terrorist network online and so on, we could see, so that was as censorship started becoming quite successful online, so when terrorist groups were visibly disrupted by censorship, we could see that there are also like a broader range of people that are not, could not be identified as explicit terrorist group supporters, but they also appear to share similar interests or like be at least they're particularly vulnerable to terrorist propaganda when it comes to specific themes of propaganda, such as victimhood or similar aspect of propaganda that you know they demonstrate, they show interest in specific themes, and we see how they become vulnerable to this type of propaganda. Now, with the impact of censorship, of course, it's harder to identify how those particular audiences would become, you know, vulnerable, and how, whether or not they constitute potential supporters of terrorist organization, or whether or not they're actually just sensitive or receptive to one specific narrative. So, I mean, I think that to go back to the question of how to break the clusters, this is to be envisioned as almost a different approach to counter-narratives, like as something totally different. It's really to bring people, you know, openly and of course like with full transparency, to bring them to raise awareness about the fact that there's a segregation of of communities, of different groups of people that might share different views, raise awareness, almost treat it as a public health issue almost, and start inviting people to sort of meet each other and come out of their comfort zone. And of course, I mentioned social media having an impact on this, but I think that again, it's just like when it comes to terrorism itself or extremism, it's a whole of society approach, and of course, it has to be done ideally online as much as offline, as much as online.
And would an element of randomness assist here? So, Erin, you were saying, you know, we can't, as a private sector company, as a social media company, we can't say, right, you need a little bit of an injection of some left-wing thinking or some right. But would some randomness help? Because so much of our advertising is now targeted. We can choose whether we want targeted adverts or not, and most of us choose it because the untargeted ones are so random that they're really irritating. But would a little bit of randomness help? Would a little bit of exposure every now and then to different ideas quite randomly really help break down some of these divides and reduce the bubble effect, at least?
Yeah, I suppose this is where it'd be great for researchers in the room and elsewhere to jump on the bandwagon. I think there's quite a lot of research out there about filter bubbles. Some of it's fascinating because some people say, actually, in your online newsfeed, you're probably exposed, if you were to analyze what's in your newsfeed, you're probably exposed to a variety of different opinions that you wouldn't just come across on the street, because we self-select our radio stations, or if we're reading newspapers, or the friends that we have, we don't go, let's find something we disagree on and become best friends. That being said, there's a lot to be said of if you're in a process of radicalization, for example, or if you're going down the rabbit hole, whether that's in conspiracy theories or in violent extremist thought, you can very quickly create self-selective echo chambers. And so that's choices that people are making online, and the tooling does allow for that. I mean, flat earthers, what? So we do have to be aware of that, I think. But I think that an element of it has to be organic. And I think that's where, without the social programs, whether it's online or offline, the fluidity, we can all sort of smell falsehoods if somebody comes to us like a ad saying, you know, don't do drugs, don't be an extremist. It feels fake. You really need real people behind it. You need real momentum. You need actual programs. I know that some of the things we've tried to do are things like the Online Civil Courage Initiative, which is just trying to train practitioners and identifying amazing things that they're doing offline and trying to teach them how and where can the online space benefit who they're trying to reach out to. Another really interesting study that was carried out just on Facebook Messenger was the one-to-one initiative, where in phase one, former extremists worked with practitioners to reach out to individuals that were on a spectrum of extremism through Facebook Messenger, and basically cold called them and said, hi, let's chat. And they were allowed to put it in their own words. Facebook didn't fund phase 1, but when we heard about it, we did fund phase 2. And it was fascinating because we did discourse analysis on what approach actually worked to get a response back from somebody on a spectrum. So do you go in and do you say, hi, I'm a former, I also had a swastika tattoo, I see that you're getting into this, let's chat? Or do you start somewhere like, hey, we both like mixed martial arts, that's really big in the far right spectrum, by the way, let's chat? Or do you go in and say something completely benign? And so it talked about just humanizing the other, and we, on the liberal and conservative side, we other each other because we disagree, and that happens. We see that in politics and the polarity, and that is within extremes, but we also other those that we label extremists. And it's the more human approaches, the more we can turn a group chat or a piece of counter speech into a one-to-one dialogue. That's when radicalization works best, and to your point of why women were such good recruiters, they put in the hours. They sat and had conversations with people and got to know them and made them part of the family through an online conversation. That's where women were optimized as recruiters. And the same thing is true of countering or preventing extremism. If someone's on a spectrum, humanizing them, understanding the grievances that they come from. Oftentimes the grievances are very valid, whether real or perceived, and having a dialogue that is very real. That's actually the best for prevention. And that's not going to be an algorithm, but it can be done through programmatic structures and support.
Great. Any other questions? Take one at the front, one in the middle, and one on the side. I'll take 3 together because we're running close up to the end. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Charlie Parker. I'm from The Times, and I'm a Chatham House member. So my questions are for Erin. You just mentioned that you said the tooling provides kind of the space for the process of like radicalization in terms of the filter bubbles and so forth. So I was just wondering, how far is Facebook responsible for enabling individual radicalization and the spread of terrorism by giving it that space? Do you think it's fair that the UK government expects Facebook, which is a social media company, to kind of safeguard public safety? So in 2014, David Cameron said that Facebook could have prevented the murder of Lee Rigby by flagging the Facebook posts of the attacker. So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you. In the middle, please.
Inga Trautig, PhD student at King's and research fellow at ICSR. So my question is for Dunya. I found it really interesting how you pointed out that very often when we talk about counterterrorism, like maybe inadvertently, immediately a security lens is switched on. So my question is, in what ways can parts of the private industry next to online platforms be involved in countering terrorism or countering extremism? Maybe through sub-issues that are less contentious or something?
Thank you. Just next to you there. Is there anyone else?
Hi, Commander Matt Bowden, and I'm going to apologise in advance because I feel like I'm in a room of very, very bright people.
Put the microphone a bit closer to you.
Sorry, there you go, you see, good example. My question's sort of shaped out of...
The microphone's directional, so if you put it in the direction of your mouse, that would be
In the direction?
Great. Yeah, perfect.
Did you get my name? My question's sort of shaped out of the comments that you've made. Historically in warfare, what we see is that state actors develop technology, they develop various articles of warfare, instruments of warfare. My concern is, based on the conversations that I'm listening to standing here, or sitting here, is that we're now looking at a situation where terrorism has gone through a recruiting part of using the internet. It's gone through a sort of an approach of publication and advertisement of what it wants to do and what it wants to achieve. How concerned is the panel that actually the information environment now presents much more of a direct threat from terrorism, particularly with the advent of quantum computing, quantum communications, which I'm equally concerned about? I'm just very interested in what your sort of perspectives are on that.
Thank you. So over here. First, thank you.
Thank you. My name is William Kapoor. I'm Vice President of Africa Security Forum. So my question is about, I know that cybersecurity is an issue on the African continent because there's lack of investment in cybercrime and cyber war and cyber terror as well. So, following on the question about the gender. We've seen that only the 20% of women are in cybersecurity. So I was reading the stats from another research, is to find out how Facebook engage with communities, especially in local languages, because there's a rise of terrorist groups like Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram in Central Africa, and recently the American embassy has to close on Monday because of terrorist threats. And we found out that there are many girls being recruited to be terrorists. So how Facebook engage in fighting or raise awareness among those girls? Thank you.
Thank you. There was one person here, and then I'm going to have to go, all right, one person, and then I'm going to finish. So be very quick.
Very quick. Hello, I'm Denise. I'm a student at Brunel University, International Politics, and Policy Advisor for Volt UK. My question is actually very brief regarding the issue of privacy versus security. We have many internet users nowadays that turn to the dark web to because it's safer, there is more freedom of speech, and some publications don't get banned. What is the increase in the exposure that they have to extremist content on the dark web versus regular web?
Thank you. Last question, just
Samantha Mountford. I'm a Vigilon, but I work across physical and cybersecurity. So my question was going back to the AI and the face recognition, where it's internal terrorism with brands within the Chinese government that are being opened up to free-for-all with access. Now, from my background, many of these systems that people aren't realizing are being hacked and being passed around on the internet for information from an internal principal. So the theory of electronic and physical security is kind of being disregarded in many of the security threats within the world, basically.
Thank you. Right. There's a good range of questions. We've got no minutes to do it in. So we have to go backwards in time. I'm sure our quantum capabilities will allow us to at some point. Please, we'll start with Aaron and work backwards to Stephanie.
Okay. So, tooling.
Yeah,
I'll just touch really quickly on things. I mean, I think it's important that all of our platforms have evolved, and I think it's the unfortunate truth in life, not just online, but we learn probably more from our errors than our successes. And as long as we're learning and evolving from those, then we can at least get to a better place. But I think it's important that, again, we work a lot with law enforcement and the Home Office and others. We talk a lot about trends. We also train different governments on the right way to request data, because despite what some might think, we don't just give it away, but we do train law enforcement as well as communicate with law enforcement to talk about what trends they're seeing, because we're only seeing a part of it online. Terrorism predates the internet. And so a lot of these trends that we're seeing, we need to be able to see it from a lot of different perspectives in order to move forward and in order to assess threat. And the topic of extremism, you're not going to catch everyone. Not everyone is going to fully identify themselves. And again, the better we get at countering the obvious stuff, the more people are not going to use our platform for the more obvious part of their conversation. So again, we're having to follow different pieces of the puzzles and work with each other. I think about when we look at how terrorism is changing, when we work with the GIFCT, with the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism, we're not just inviting social media companies to the table, we're engaging with fintech and transportation and sales and merchandising. Different platforms have been used to sell goods, to be used for just getting from point A to point B. So these are all different vulnerabilities that, as long as there's an awareness, you can start preventing and learning from other abuse areas to sort of tighten up the areas that might be more obviously abused at the very least, and then see where tech works multi-platform for some of those solves. But it won't be for everything. Sometimes it's just making sure it's in your terms of service and making sure you have operational people that understand what that looks like. As far as Africa goes, we have an entire team that are based in different parts and focused on different regions of Africa. Africa's a massive area with lots of languages. I just recently engaged in I hopped from Burkina Faso to Benin to Nigeria, and Nigeria alone has, over 200 languages. So when we brag about having over 50 languages full-time 24/7, Nigeria is not so impressed, I'm sure. But we have to work a lot with outsourced individuals for some of the minority languages or some of the different dialects. And when it concerns violent extremism, that's where my team will go in and make sure it's a two-way knowledge sharing. It's not just me saying what I'm seeing online, but that I'm understanding with my team what it looks like on the ground, or that my public policy team that just focuses on Africa says why it looks a little bit different there than it does in France or than it does in Singapore. And again, that's just a constant evolution. We worked a lot with some of the activists in Africa around things like Bring Back Our Girls, or some of the strategic prevention work around making sure that there was better awareness in different communities. But that's more to be done, constantly more to be done. So I think only by reaching out and working with people on the ground, it's not going to be virtual. It has to be on the ground in a lot of places as well. And then on the dark web, I guess, go and talk to Jamie Bartlett. I think he wrote pretty comprehensively about it. I think sometimes we're afraid that because it's called the dark web, that bad actors are on the dark web. They're probably not as much on there as you think they are. I think some are, but just because of how easy it is to communicate or network, they're probably not on there as much as you think they might be. It's very hard to study the dark web, but I think that's going to be an increasing concern as we get better above the dark web at pushing some of these spaces out. So I think that is a concern for law enforcement as well. I think I've touched on most of the comments there.
Dunya.
Yeah, so the question about trying to tackling those issues, but outside, from a different scope, maybe not from the scope of security. I think it's the same. The same logic applies to why governments themselves are not credible when it comes to applying preventive approaches, or why tech companies themselves, without the help of civil society, are struggling to actually have the credibility or the legitimacy to address those issues. It's exactly the same problem, is that the population, often the population or the audiences that could be vulnerable or exposed to those narratives, do not necessarily understand, the questions of the themes that are addressed through propaganda as as being security sensitive, or limited to the question of security. They understand this from a social perspective. For them, it's like in some cases it's because, and this has been addressed across the literature on this topic. Like what is the real cause? Is it like high unemployment amongst the youth? Is it like feeling alienated, disenfranchised, like the youth actually being disenfranchised, being alienated from the mainstream political sphere? There are all sorts of questions. And the thing is that often one of the reasons why this question is so politically sensitive and hard to debate is because it's too broad. So it would help to narrow it down and try to address it with the people concerned from that particular sociological perspective. So, and it would help these private sector members to become involved, because it's really easy for them, it's less risky for them to become engaged on issues related to climate change or a sustainable development, because those are not that as I said, controversial issues. But if you break it down to, I don't know, as I said, digital literacy, or youth unemployment, maybe in one specific context when it is actually relevant, then it would resonate more, and actually, as a matter of fact, it would potentially help policymakers and practitioners from a broad range of institutions to understand the complexity, better understand the complexity of this issue, this question.
Thank you. Last words, Stephanie.
I will take the first question from the commander on the information environment as a threat. I think you're absolutely right that it is, and I think there's some really interesting ways of studying it. So, this sort of classical approach that you would have from your security background. Something that really interested me when watching WannaCry and NotPetya was, they rippled through so quickly, right, around the world. But I was like, who's not getting hit? Like, who gets hit first, but also like who doesn't get hit? Where's your vulnerability? And the really obvious questions were things like, do you have business anywhere in Ukraine? like instant risk factor that you would be looking at. But I was really intrigued to, and this is when I first started looking at the role of Israel, which seems to be not hit by certain things as often, and certain intelligence sharing partnerships. And this has also intrigued me with the public sector, private sector partnership, which was part of our brief here that I would like to touch on briefly. Some countries are doing a much better job at helping to educate the public and have really good, robust, rigorous debates about this, and we're in one of them. I just want to sort of signal that and say, it's great to be here in the United Kingdom where we have a really active and maybe even activist regulator, but even something like the National Cybersecurity Center is on Twitter, but also online, pumping out and sharing research, sponsoring youth competitions to cultivate the next generation of people who will have to fight this. So I think we're in a country right now that takes this really seriously. I'm interested in what Estonia is doing with biometrics, with their bespoke national blockchain system. And it's very easy to look at something like Estonia. Again, these are small countries versus bigger countries, countries that have broadband penetration across the entire country. We're here in the United Kingdom where I can't get certain broadband in parts of this country. You think, what's going on here? One of the things that when I talked to the Chief Innovation Officer of Estonia, who I interviewed a year ago, he was saying that even the elderly are super switched on and online, so they know they're a little bit better at protecting themselves against fraud, digital literacy, as a way of protecting kids. I think there's so many different ways that we can parse this and study this. It's just going to be about marshaling it together and sharing it. And in theory, that's where being a network problem, having a network solution should be to our advantage. I think the difficulty is also just the noise, and everybody's exhausted all the time. My solution is to sort of shut down and pull off of a lot of these platforms, because I just think, just shut down some of these systems. And that might be a trend that we also see as well. So in terms of just for what the average ordinary citizen could do, on the nation state level, it's far greater. And I would like to see much greater collaboration between researchers, companies, and government, and a much easier, porous nature of people traveling in and out of those. Because I think otherwise you get stuck in your institution and you can't share best practice, and you can't have the annoying person in the room who keeps probing but might actually be the one who's onto something. So thank you for your question. It's definitely made me think.
Thanks very much. Thanks to everyone for being here. Thanks for your great questions. Thanks to our three panelists for an excellent presentation. Thanks to WISE UK for the partnership. So we look forward to seeing you at the next one. So thanks.